All right. Hey, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, we are back taking a look at the tropics. Tonight is Friday, September 24th, 2021. This is your evening tropical update. Well, since the last time we talked on YouTube and on Facebook, we've had some pretty significant changes in the tropics. Last time we chatted, we were talking about Tropical Depression 18, which was back here and is now Hurricane Sam in the Central Atlantic Basin. Most of the video will be on Sam this evening as we track its slow, agonizing crawl towards, threatening the eastern U.S. in some capacity, but we're definitely not sure how much yet. But we that's not the only player tonight. We do have a new subtropical storm north of Bermuda. This is Sub-Tropical Storm Teresa, a very short-lived subtropical storm formed from a non-tropical low that kind of just wandered around north of Bermuda, and that system has a very short window. And also, last time we talked, we had Peter and Rose. They have both since, petered out or withered away, or whatever the jokes you want to make about Peter and Rose. They're out of the picture, so we do have Teresa, Sam, and then the Hurricane Center is also monitoring another wave coming off of Africa in a couple days that's going to attempt to make the same pilgrimage that Sam is making right now. So let's go ahead and look at the National Hurricane Center's map as you see all three of your systems there. I'll show you Teresa real quick. It's not very impressive. This is one of these storms that we name that could really kind of go either way. It's producing some nice gale force winds. Subtropical classification is a little spotty again because we're talking about a system that's not fully feeding off ocean water warmth, but it's also not a pure like winter type low pressure that's just a mix of hot and cold air through the atmosphere. It's kind of doing a little bit of both, so you kind of get these little hybrid systems. um, the thing is with these, we've had about 9 of these this year. So while we are about to exhaust the naming list, which we are, that is T. So we only have Victor and Wanda, I believe, are the last two names. And then we are done with the 2021 hurricane season name list. We'll have exhausted all um, 21 named storm names, and we'll have to rotate to the auxiliary naming list, which is a new practice for 21. We're not using the Greek alphabet like we did last year. We will be in the alternate naming list. So Teresa is the second earliest 19th named storm on record. Only 2020 had the 19th named storm earlier because by this time last year, we were already in the Greek alphabet. We were already in beta or something like that. So, um, significant from a naming perspective and whatnot, but not a significant storm. This system is going to just, basically survive about a day, and then this cold front that's, coming in from the west is going to push this away out to sea. Not going to be an issue. I think the surf's already kind of tore up over New England anyway from all the frontal passage, but not going to be a big deal otherwise. Not much else to talk about with that. So we turn our attention to Hurricane Sam. As a 5 p.m. advisory, the maximum sustained winds were 85 miles an hour. That's likely increased as we observed Sam rapidly intensifying this evening. Moving us to the west at 12 miles per hour. The next Hurricane Center updates in about an hour and a half. We're recording about 9:30. And I'm going to guess the Hurricane Center is going to bump this up probably well into Category 2, probably around 105 mile an hour winds or so. Sam definitely expected to intensify, pretty rapidly for the next couple of days. Expected to be a major hurricane by tomorrow and stay a major hurricane through the weekend and into early next week. And at the end of the 5-day cone, we see this thing passing pretty close to the northern Antilles, with the future of the storm from there pretty in question. So as we talked about last time, I wanted to kind of give a quick perspective where we go into the satellite and all that other stuff. Just looking at this cone, we're talking 5 days from now. This is Friday night. Okay, so we're talking about Wednesday. The storm's still being a couple hundred miles near away from the Antilles. Okay, which are the islands here that kind of start the entrance to the Caribbean. There's still a long way between Sam and the U.S. at the end of 5 days. We're talking about any potential threat to the eastern U.S. like into next weekend, like 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 sort of days. So when we talk about the forecast uncertainty, a lot of this is just because the storm is still so far away. It's not moving very fast. It's in a pretty light steering flow for this time of year. It's kind of a weird setup for this part of the season, and it is just very far away in general. So I want to keep that perspective when we're talking about the forecast. So let's go ahead and look at Sam on the satellite presentation real quick. Obviously, a lot better than the last time we checked on it when it was a tropical depression. That eye is kind of what's going to catch your eye as we look at that, the eye starting to clear out of the storm this evening. You see it pop up for a couple frames right as the sun sets, and then it disappears, and then it reappears right there. And what we have here is a rapidly intensifying hurricane, likely already into Category 2. We see that kind of buzzsaw sort of look with the twin outflow channels to the north and to the south. And this is a storm that's over very warm water, very light wind shear, and really has nothing bothering it. Earlier this morning, it became a hurricane at 5 a.m., but then it had a little bit of a halt in its intensification process. We see this morning on a microwave pass at 9:40 Z, about 5:40 this morning Eastern time. We had a pretty degraded core, only half of a feature kind of starting, but there was a very busted, like kind of degraded west side. Some dry air had snuck into the storm and really punched in the right side. So it like became a hurricane and then it leveled off through most of the morning and early afternoon. But later this afternoon, about the 5 p.m. advisory and beyond, we've seen a much more improved storm. This is a more recent pass earlier this evening. You see the core fully rebuilt, much more organized, much tighter. I believe Sam underwent an eyewall replacement cycle as well. If we look at the different microwave band earlier this today about 2 o'clock this afternoon, we can see a outer eye wall wrapping into the inner eye wall, and this is a pretty common sign of an eyeball replacement cycle, which is when the inner eye becomes too small, it contracts and contracts, and then a larger eye kind of forms around it, and then that smaller eye kind of falls out. This causes the storm to increase in size, and it does bring the overall winds down usually or halts intensification, but it spreads them out over a larger area. So the winds spread out, the storm spreads out, and then it can kind of re-intensify from there and it's become a little bit bigger. Sam's not a very big storm right now, but these kind of cycles will cause Sam to grow into a larger hurricane over the next few days. And now that is probably finished, that eye clears out on satellite imagery. You can see it here on the zoomed in look a little bit better. It clouds up, and then boom, it comes out. There's thunderstorms wrapping around the center. You have a nice central dense overcast. You have two outflow channels. There could still be a little bit of dry air trying to sneak in here, but this inner core is much stronger than last time, and it's less likely that dry air is really going to have a big effect on it. And Sam is moving into a more moist environment, moving away from the dry air. So all systems look like they're go for some intensification tonight, and I would expect this to be a Category 2 hurricane tonight and probably Category 3 by 5 a.m. or 11 a.m. All right, so let's talk about the future track of the system. Well, we'll look at the official track, and you see that it falls in pretty well with some of our hurricane models. Right now, the confidence is still a decent amount that this is probably going to miss the Northern Antilles. However, some models, such as the European model, keep suggesting that Sam may get closer to these islands, the Northern Antilles, Guadeloupe, and Montserrat, and a couple other ones, closer than, is comfortable for now. But definitely doesn't look like the consensus is not that it's going to hit. So I can show the GFS and European models. Right now, the GFS, pretty much all their members do show the storm moving north and whatnot. The European is showing more models pushing in towards the islands, and even the evening European model, this is valid for Thursday of next week, shows it pretty much almost making landfall in the most northern of those islands. But I do want to point out when you're looking at these models, the European still thinks that Sam, on all the members, is a tropical storm, where the GFS sees it that it's much closer to a hurricane than it actually is. Models are going to have a delay in their run versus what's actually happening. They're already 6 hours or so behind, and the GFS is not nearly as good as picking up on strength as the Euro is because it doesn't get as much data from the Atlantic Basin as we give the GFS. So the Euro is a lot slower on the pickup for these things. And unless the Euro is already intensifying it on its own, it's always going to be behind. So a weaker SAM wants to go more south and west. A stronger SAM wants to go more north and west. It wants to go more north and stay on the right side of this cone as you're moving down it, where a weaker storm wants to be on the left side. So while the Euro is continuing to suggest that it may push into those islands, the Euro has a bias of not seeing the storm as strong as it should be, and the European typically overestimates the strength of ridges. Okay, because that's really what we're watching. We'll go ahead and back the arrow up and just show you, but basically the rough idea here is Sam is kind of embedded down here in this pretty weak steering flow. There's a high pressure ridge kind of anchored off in the central Atlantic, general clockwise flow around this one. So it's kind of pushing Sam along and it's kind of nudging it towards these islands. There's a more complex flow in here. If you watch Levi Cowan's video, fellow that runs Tropical Tidbits website, it's great. I use it all the time. He breaks it down in better detail about how there's actually a high more over Africa, and it's kind of ridging like this, and then there's it's kind of pushing Sam more, south and north, so it's trying to lift the storm up later in the week. It's kind of complex, but basically there's a weak steering flow that's going to generally favor some kind of northward turn around the islands. The only question is really how close it may or may not get. Again, for now, the consensus is it probably stays off the islands, but we don't know for sure. So that's the first leg, okay? Now we talk about how could this maybe look for the U.S. down the road. Well, like I explained earlier, we're talking about 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 days. So we are forecasting beyond 7 days. You're taking an educated guess, okay? One thing we are pretty sure about is there's going to be some sort of trough over the eastern U.S. There's going to be like another one of those kind of fall cold fronts right in towards the end of September, early October. And we're going to have this trough off the eastern U.S. Now, normally this would be the ticket out for Sam. It would come up, this trough would kick it up, and it would go, pew, and it would just not be a problem. When we go, hey, fall saved us from another hurricane. That happens all the time in this pattern. What happens is, you have all these highs over the eastern U.S. in the August and September, and that lets the storms come across and make landfall. But then the fall cold fronts show up, and then these hurricanes start being thrown away and out to sea by the fall cold fronts, and then you start getting storms down here in October. That's the basic idea of how the pattern goes. Well, when you're talking about this situation, though, it could be a little bit different. Both the models are indicating that this trough over the eastern U.S. is going to cut off. Now, that means that an upper level low is going to develop somewhere off the mid Atlantic coast, it appears, as we go into Thursday and Friday. You can see here by Friday, the European has an upper level low that's cut off from the jet stream. The jet stream went like this, it went around the low, and now the low is just sitting here spinning on its own. This is an upper level feature. Okay, so this has a clockwise flow or a counterclockwise flow to it, and you have a high here with a clockwise flow. So again, Sam is looking to try to figure out how to sneak between these two features and out to sea. It may be able to. The positioning and the juxtaposition of these storms or systems may allow it to do that. There's also potential where this low is kind of pushing it into the coastline because sometimes this ridge is too strong. You have too much high pressure here, and Sam, instead of going out to sea, instead just kind of pinwheels around the upper low, and it could go into the coast somewhere. And again, this low is very hard to forecast because our models don't really know exactly what to do with it. GFS is kind of the same way. You can see here the GFS, again, Friday afternoon, the low is off the coast of Florida, but it's a little bit further out. Sam goes further out, and then Sam finds a way to sneak out to sea. However, I go back to different model runs from today, we can see that the features move around. GFS earlier this morning had the upper level low, this feature here, closer to the coast, and the ridge much stronger than before. So if I go back to earlier today or later today, see this little feature right here, this little low that's kind of embedded in the jet, this little like short wave right here is kind of what it looks like, kind of shows up. Well, that may coax Sam to move out to sea because if I show you, whoop, disappears, all good. But then if I go 2 model runs earlier, that feature is not there. Well, now there's a bunch of high pressure sitting here. So Sam doesn't really have as long, it takes longer to find that little trough and get out of town. And maybe that trough never shows up. And then maybe this little shortwave never digs down and then it's blocked. So, and then you have an East Coast threat on your hands, and if you go back even further in the models, it moves all around. Maybe they link up, maybe they don't. Maybe the storm just does whatever. Most of the GFS members do show this thing turning, but like the European, for example, doesn't always show that. The European shows it maybe going up towards Nova Scotia. There's a lot of potential solutions. So the principle here is that there's going to be a very chaotic pattern over the eastern U.S. come the time that Sam approaches, and there's no guarantee this just goes out to sea and it's no problem. If you had to put a gun to my head, I would say it's probably going to find a way out to sea based off historical analysis and based on the fact that how strong it is. It's hard for a very strong hurricane to not figure out how to sneak out to sea without hitting the eastern U.S. first. But putting some weird upper level low over the, the mountains of the eastern U.S., I mean, that might be a problem. So we're going to keep watching it. We have a lot of time to watch it. And it is a concern of some kind, but like the concern level for, say, the Northern Antilles and whatnot is probably medium, whereas the U.S. should be on low until we know more, and we're not going to know more until like the middle of next week. So we're going to keep an eye on it. It's going to be a strong hurricane. It's going to be a big hurricane. There's going to be a bunch of clickbait headlines about it. Just ignore them. Just tune into the Hurricane Center, people like me, whatever, that give you the right advice and give you the right message. And we'll watch it as it comes along, and we'll see if it can make some history or if it just goes out to sea and doesn't bother anybody. So that's what I got for you guys tonight. As always, thanks for watching, and have a good one.